Okay, we're live. Okay, well, go ahead. Did you want to start us off after the break, or you know, launch right in?
Yes, we could go right ahead.
Okay. Welcome back from the break. So we are joined by some of the guests who are working on the models and the data, and for Department of Public Service has heard some of that conversation this morning. Brattle Group, you have not, but you'll be caught up to speed, I think, pretty quickly with the questions that come your way. Let's start with this hour of just a quick review of who's involved, and then we'll get towards the end of, before 11, we'll be talking about the specifics of the 1 through 8 work topics. So I'm happy to take the lead here, or can pass the baton if you want to talk about who's involved.
It's fine. If
Yeah,
you're
go ahead.
ready to roll,
Yeah.
go ahead, please.
Okay, so roles of the work group members, co-chairs, and public is where my brain is right now. So the roles of the work group members: participate, right, to add your expertise and your insight and advice. Roles of the co-chairs will be part of the planning committee in designing the agendas and structuring, helping structure some of this time. Role of the public: there are opportunities for the public to speak during these meetings, and there may or may not be other opportunities for public comment too. Now that we have co-chairs elected, it will be a little easier to map out a process for the next couple of months. But in the meantime, again, this is a conversation that the impacts are far and wide even beyond this table, and so the role of the public is to stay engaged and interested and inform. And the role of this group is to find ways to get that information to the table and animating the conversations. There are others who are also going to be joining these conversations to bring sources of data and modeling and information. And so this is a time for you to ask questions of them and for them to talk a little bit about what they're doing. The two key parties would be the Department of Public Service and also the Brattle Group. And I'll let each of those entities speak on their own behalf around the work they're doing, because they'll be more concrete than I. You can pin your questions to them directly to their comments. And I believe it was Christopher who might have had some questions for me as the facilitator, and others of you might as well. What is my role here in general to help hold a space so that you can use this time as effectively as possible, and to keep my ears open as an impartial party in this particular conversation, so that I can help hold a process for those thoughts and comments to find their way into the conversation instead of following a de facto pattern that you may have had before, which if it serves you, we can go there. But if it didn't serve you and there are other pieces that need to get into the mix, that's my job, is to help figure out how to make that happen. What I'd like to do is invite our guests to talk about their work so that you can ask questions. My inclination is to start with the Department of Public Service. And I think, Claire, this means that you will be stepping onto our presentation stage. Claire is joining us online. What I've asked is for each person to just share their name and organization, and to start off with 1 to 3 things that you'd like this group to know. So Claire, we'll start with you, then we'll move to the Brattle Group, and then open it up for discussion or questions to either of you. Claire, go ahead when you're ready.
Thanks, Jen. Just sound check. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Claire McElveny. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a data and equity policy manager with the Department of Public Service, working in the planning division with TJ, who I believe will be arriving imminently, probably while I'm giving our overview, if not shortly thereafter, so he can jump in and answer questions as well once he arrives. I actually had shared a slide with Jen that I hopefully will be able, oh, perfect, thanks, Jen. Just to give some context, I think both to the 2 points Jen had asked us to speak in terms of what we'd be able to share with the working group, and then any like 1 or 2 key takeaways or points we'd like to make at this point. And I just wanted to start by providing this kind of overview of the process that the department has been engaged in since late last year, really, because I've heard a number of folks ask questions about it or wonder what has been including. And This slide comes actually out of our public engagement plan that we had issued in December of last year with some modifications to reflect what we've actually been working through, whereas that was proposed. So we've approached this process really in 3 phases. The first starting early this year, just building some awareness and capacity and offering educational opportunities around the electric system in Vermont. And bringing awareness to the fact that we were conducting a public process to review existing renewable electricity programs and policies. And actually, I'll just step back. One of the reasons we started this process really stemmed from recommendations made in the 2022 Comprehensive Energy Plan, and then also recommendations made in the 2021 Climate Action Plan around reviewing the RES and related programs in a transparent process and/or making specific modifications to it. And this process really stemmed from learning from developing those plans and the public process that went on informing those 2 plans and the recommendations. So that informed this process, which started really with some educational opportunities, knowing that this is a big, nuanced and technical process, and we wanted to create some ways to engage with the public and provide some kind of grounding data and foundation from which to move. The second phase that we've really been in the meat of the last couple of years, which I think touches on kind of the data pieces and other information we'll be able to provide that has been mentioned today, has really focused on reviewing existing programs and policies themselves. So we did some statewide polling and focus groups that really took place, the meat of which was June through July of this year. We just received the final report and are thinking about when to make that public, hopefully in the next week or so. The technical analyses, which I've heard lots of comments and questions on, which we can certainly try and address, which kicked off in really the beginning of July, but started in June when we held a process to develop a stakeholder advisory group that has been helping shape that analysis through particularly providing input into the scenarios that will be modeled. We've done some limited outreach to community-based organizations to try and better understand the needs of communities that may not be as robustly represented in these types of processes. And then also are working and about to launch a series of regional statewide events in partnership with our regional planning commissions. And those are slated to kick off next week, actually. And then the final phase of this process really will focus on reviewing the results of that process and then finalizing any reports, thinking about recommendations or key learnings have emerged, and then having some sort of public comment period in a more traditional sense where we can get some additional feedback before finalizing the results of this process in time to inform the next legislative session. So that's kind of a big overview of the whole process we've undertaken. And in terms of, just drilling down into specific data points we might be able to provide or to this group to inform your work would be kind of the outputs of the public engagement components. So I mentioned we've been doing the statewide polling and focus groups with a consultant Mass Inc. polling group. The results of that are just final as of the end of last week. And so happy to provide input or provide the results or a presentation, and that will be public shortly. And then also, of course, the regional events that are about to kick off will occur throughout September, and we would hope to have final summaries towards the end of October, maybe early November. And then, of course, also with the technical analyses, there'll be a number of data points available to directly inform the work of the Brattle Group. I heard some questions about the scenarios being involved in that analysis, so I'll just try and address those quickly. We are working, as mentioned, to identify 6 different scenarios to model in addition to a sort of business as usual scenario. Those scenarios have been shaped in a number of different ways. We had included 4 of them in the request for proposals that we issued, which we actually had circulated to a wide stakeholder group to review and inform before we finalized it. And then we've been working with our stakeholder advisory group over the last 6 weeks through a number of meetings and surveys to refine 2 additional scenarios. So the RFP kind of outlined 4 specific scenarios and then left 2 to be shaped and informed by that stakeholder advisory group. And we are in the final stages of finalizing all 6 of those scenarios. I'm happy to, I think either TJ or I could speak to on the specifics of those. And so those will include outputs, a number of key metrics around things like avoided greenhouse gas emissions, additional costs of renewable energy of the various scenarios, and other measures around through cost benefit analyses that we're conducting. So I'm going to pause there because that was a lot of information. Happy to take questions, but I guess I will conclude with kind of the one point was that we feel like this process is really still ongoing. We're excited to start seeing some of the results of it, but are feeling at this point for us that it's too soon to draw any specific conclusions from what we're learning since we're still in the process of hearing from Vermonters.
Okay. Thanks, Claire. I'm going to ask you to hold the questions for a minute. If you have questions for Claire, take a moment to jot them down. And I do want to encourage us to hear from the Brattle Group first and then take questions for both. Claire, TJ is in the room now. Welcome. If you want to come to the table, you're welcome. If you want to sit back, that's fine also from the Department of Public Service. So let's hear from the Brattle Group and then we'll take questions for all. John, are you there? There you are. Would you take a moment just to share your name and organization and talk a little bit about one to 3 things that you'd like this group to know around the Brattle Group's work and role?
Hi, I'm Dean Murphy with the Brattle Group. I'm a principal based in our Boston office. I've been working in the electric industry for a number of decades and have done a lot of work in New England recently, looking at decarbonization issues across New England states. We've been engaged by the JFO in this engagement to take those scenarios that Claire just introduced and to do a macroeconomic analysis of each one of those 6 scenarios. So the benefit cost analysis that will be performed by DPS's consultant, SEA, will specify the direct impacts of those 6 scenarios. And we will do a macroeconomic analysis that will also include the indirect economic impacts of those. So the knock-on effects on GDP and on jobs of developing additional renewable resources, some of which may be in Vermont, some may not be in Vermont. I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Wanjun Chang, to introduce himself, and then he can say a little bit more about our analysis.
Hi, I'm Wanjun Chang. I'm an economist with the Brattle Group. At Brattle, I help lead the development of our electricity generation capacity expansion model and our economic impact assessment model, which we'll be talking a bit about today. Jennifer, is it possible to share our screen, to share a couple of slides?
You get permission for you to share a slide?
Yes, I'll do that.
It's on your side, yep.
Okay.
And while that's getting pulled up, Dean, my apologies for not updating my mental model to what was actually showing up on the screen. I didn't mean to overlook you. Okay, there you go. You're live on the screen.
No worries.
All right. So we're due to meet with the SEA team, the team carrying out the benefit cost analysis next week on precisely how our modeling frameworks will work together. So at this point, we don't have too many specifics, but we thought we could use a few minutes today to, at a pretty high level, go over our modeling approach. Okay. All right, so our economic impact results will be modeled to be consistent with SEA's benefit cost model, which captures the direct net benefit to Vermont. So we quickly go over what the benefit cost model broadly captures, given what we've seen so far from the BCA methodology slides. The benefit cost model captures these things, so that the cost of building renewable energy resources and the cost of integrating them to the grid, the avoided cost to the electricity sector, including reduced transmission and distribution cost and improved generation reliability, price effects, including reduction in wholesale electricity prices due to increased renewable penetration, and there's also societal benefits, mainly consisting of environmental benefits from reduced pollution. So now, if we treat the costs and benefits specified in the BC model, the benefit cost model, as the source of impacts that create direct costs and benefits to Vermont, our macroeconomic model beyond captures the economy-wide ripple effects, or the indirect effects that are induced by these impact sources. So these indirect effects are measured by Vermont state GDP, at least in the scope of this study, and employment metrics. So on this slide, you'll see that I've color-coded the text to match the impact source to the economic impact. Go over a few. Cost of building and integrating renewable energy resources will largely have two effects. Vermont's electricity sector will engage in less efficient production to output initially a unit of electricity due to increased capital costs imposed by the renewable energy standard. This by itself could have a short-term reduction in economic growth, but costs also mean spending. So when we incur costs to procure and connect renewable energy resources, the costs are being paid mainly to the manufacturing, construction, and services sectors, increasing economic activity, which is a really big impact. This contributes to furthering economic growth. Avoided electricity sector costs have the opposite effect. The electricity sector experiences more efficient production due to less input goods demanded, but reduced costs in the electricity sector also means decreased economic activity in the rest of the economy. Ratepayer bill savings translate into more funds available to spend on other non-energy goods, more disposable income for consumers, more budget for businesses to spend on other production inputs. So production sectors will end up producing more, end up paying more income to households who are the owners of labor and capital. And households now with more disposable income from bill savings and more income from more economic activity will increase consumption, contributing to growth in the economy. So in the end, the benefit cost model and the macroeconomic model will work together. They quantify two different impact aspects to the same shock to Vermont's economy. So the results of the respective analyses, I think, will be used together, but side by side, in providing a comprehensive assessment of cost effectiveness. Quickly, a little bit about the Beyond model. We built this model because we wanted to have full control, full transparency over the model regarding what data inputs we use and how the model assesses impacts, especially in assignments in which transparency is important. The model represents 50 states in Washington, D.C. We define 71 sectors based on sector-level data obtained from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Census Bureau, and 5 types of households by state based on income level using data from IRS. The model simulates key interactions in the US economy, including interactions between industries, households, and the government. And I say here that the model simulates these interactions based on a circular flow of economic activity, and this just means that we simulate how households purchase goods and services using the income they earn from providing labor and capital to businesses, and how businesses produce goods and services demanded by the economy and using the revenue to pay wages and capital rent to households, and how the government collects taxes from households and businesses to pay for government expenditures and provide subsidies and other benefits to the economy. Key model outputs include GDP impacts, employment by sector and region, which is important for this study, and price effects on goods and services, as well as their economic output. That's all for now from the Brattle team.
I'm guessing there are a lot of questions percolating, potentially for both of you. And I plan this as a batch Q&A, so we can go back and forth, take questions. There's maybe not as enough time to go over all the details as you'd like. So I'm just going to encourage both the questions to be brief but direct and clear as you can be, and the answers to be as brief as they can be. And if you need to direct people to other resources, we'll make note and try to get those to folks. So if you have a question, working group members, raising your hand is going to be the best way to let me know that's online and in the room. So we've got two first here, and then we have two in the room, and then I'll go to online. Go ahead.
Let me start with Dr. Chang. In your model, actually, let me just make a statement. I hope that we could get these, I don't know if these materials are available online right now for us, but I hope that we could either get them in advance next time or have them available online, just so that, because it's hard for me to see.
I know. I discovered I could turn around and see this one.
I know.
It's a lot of information as well, so.
Yeah, so that would be really helpful. That was pretty dense. In terms of your model, I'm thinking about grid resilience, and where is that measured? Is that part of the avoided costs?
Question for Brattle?
Yeah, no, yes, this is for Dr. Chang, his presentation.
Yes, the grid resilience maybe. I think the avoided costs would include having more efficient outcomes in the forward capacity auctions, right? Having more zero bid renewable resources pushing out the supply curve and lowering the capacity price, ultimately having some sort of price effect there trickling down to ratepayers. So if you look at the macro, I'll go to it. So if you look here, the grid reliability.
Let's pause for a moment. What I do want to, in the interest of time, is this answering your question? If not, what are you asking?
It's sort of, but I'm not sure that it is. So maybe, so for me, which may not be for anybody else in the room, when I think about resilience, I think about the power stays on or it comes back on quickly. And so I don't know that I'm hearing that being measured. So this is basically three parts. So are we measuring that? Two, how are we measuring that, if we are measuring that? And three, are we considering that by utility? Because Vermont has three or four really different types of utilities, and I would expect the results would be really different depending on the utility. So it would be instructive for me, at least, to have an understanding of that.
Okay.
Anybody like to clean that up? TJ might save me there.
Let's just spin to TJ real quick, and we can see how where this falls, whether it's with Brattle Group or whether it's with the other modeling.
Right. So I see this more as part of the benefit cost. Sorry for everybody. TJ Moore from the Department of Public Service. I'm the Director of Planning. Sorry I was late at an orthodontist appointment for my kid that couldn't move. But I see this as part of the benefit cost analysis that the department is doing with Sustainable Energy Advantage. So there's two ways that the kind of avoided infrastructure costs are accounted for. One is to the extent that there are load-related infrastructure costs, like, the load is too high and that is causing the need for a distribution or transmission upgrade. There will include a value as an avoided cost there. But there's another type of infrastructure cost that is, the distributed generation that's located in Vermont often upgrades transformers or lines in order to site, and they pay for that. It's included in the PPA cost. So the cost is actually included in the cost side of the equation. here, but the benefit side, we're working to figure out how much of that could have been, would have been built anyway. And if any of this DG or how much of this DG is kind of moving forward investments that might have happened in 5 years or 10 years or or whenever it may have happened. Or maybe they wouldn't have happened until the end of the natural life of that system. And so I can go into a lot more detail of how we might do that, but I think I'll stop there and let you tell me to go into that detail.
Does that answer your question?
Sort of, but then it provokes a whole bunch of other questions.
Let's I have another question first and then.
Yeah, I'll just make this as a statement rather than a question in the interest of time and say that I would hope that the Brattle Group is including the impact on the uptake of beneficial electrification of any rate changes prompted by the res into your analysis. So you don't need to answer that. I just would request that you consider the beneficial electrification adoption impacts of rates in your analysis. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
We will be including that, yes.
Thank you.
We have two comments that I'm aware of and I don't know the order. I'll go ahead and then we'll come over.
A comment and then a question. I guess I'm pretty confused about, why we're being put into silos to consider these as our potential solutions. I thought, like Louis was saying, we were going to figure out what we want the res to be and what we want reform to look like. And all of a sudden we're being told that we're going to be getting data on just these options, which is not something we've voted on or discussed. It seems we're asking this research group that's supposed to be working for this group to come up with answers for something that we've never even talked about that we as a group want.
Well, here's a little distinction. I'm going to do a little translation and you can correct if I'm wrong, but there's I'm hoping these resources are not necessarily providing answers as they're providing concrete data points that this group can work with. And in a moment, although it feels a little flip-floppy, going into the 1 through 8 in those tasks, there are some scenarios listed there, and this is the source for those scenarios.
Well, as a specific piece, then I'll end it.
Yep.
When they're going to evaluate ratepayer bill impacts, how? I mean, we as a group we put out on the table, let's discuss changing net metering or coming up with another standard offer. Like, how would you evaluate the ratepayer impacts before you know what a procurement program is going to look like?
How do you handle that kind of?
Well, I would say we would discuss what we want, what we think should be evaluated, and then we would hand it to the Brattle Group to go evaluate it.
So I have to clarify. Are you talking about the 6 scenarios going into the DPS work, or you're talking about, because they're responding to that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And
We haven't had input into the 6 scenarios. Right.
So the 6 scenarios have some input process, which I think is open. There's also a task force working on it. How does this answer this group?
So the stakeholder advisory group, which REV is a member of as our utilities were designed, we put out a nominating process, had dozens of people apply, and we were trying to fill different categories of stakeholder groups, represent regional planning commissions, kind of general public, environmental interest, utility interest. And we have had 3 meetings so far to develop scenarios. And even before that, when we put out our request for proposal, we sent out kind of our scope of work, looked for what scenarios should we model. We gave some suggestions, we modified based on those suggestions, and had 4 in our request for proposals. The SEA responded to, with 2 more to be developed by the stakeholder group. So the stakeholder group has developed those. My understanding is that the economic analysis, the macroeconomic analysis, which Brattle Group is doing, the way I think of that in shorthand is jobs and GDP impacts, right? That necessarily needs inputs. And so these scenarios, as you said, Jen, give us kind of data points, and working within that, we know, okay, here's like the base cost. Now, if this group came up with, we want to change net metering, or we want to do X, Y, or Z, those are modifications that then need to be done subsequently in kind of the process. So I don't believe that our analysis doesn't get into kind of the program design of a net metering, or if we added a standard offer that comes next. We will have a benefit cost model in an Excel workbook that can be used to make modifications.
And your concern is that having scenarios built, walking into this anchors the conversation in certain ways. And you're trying to figure out if there were other considerations where they fit. So,
I mean, like Louis said, you know, his utility is different than every other utility that are 100% renewable. Are we talking about a solution for the res that would work for WEC members? When you put everyone into one of these, it doesn't have that kind of flexibility, but if it can work, it can work.
so part of what you're trying to hold open is space to be always mindful of what are the limitations of the data points that are coming before you, what can it tell you, and then what does it still leave unanswered.
Well, it's what we said at the beginning, how can we make res reform work for each utility?
And I'm gonna hold that question with curiosity and with some trepidation for this group, because I do think that when you consider the work tasks of this group, knowing that the conversation started long before now and it's gonna continue long before these meetings end, you'll be looking at what's possible for us to figure out in this specific time frame. What's available to review, what have we been tasked with 1 through 8, and you're probably gonna interpret that in slightly different ways. And to the extent that we can find some work that's an effective use for the time, that's where my site is going. Senator Bray, and then we'll go back to questions for the consultants.
One quick thing. So Peter, you're holding up a piece of paper and I don't recognize it. So
These are the scenarios that the stakeholder advisory group is reviewing.
They're posted on the website for the DPS scenario planning.
okay. Just want to make sure I'm going to be looking at the right piece of paper.
So can we get those materials posted to our site as well?
I can get a link. I mean, one of the, also.
I mean, if they're gonna come into this discussion.
Yeah, there's a whole, my first take on it is when I was trying to figure out, even what it's all about, there's several materials that are posted there. So whether you want to duplicate the posting or link to it, I think is a question. So there's lots of different comments. I just need to see how many people are sitting on a comment. We'll finish up with Senator Bray and then we'll come here and there and then questions for the consultants.
So then while you have while we have the department and Brattle Group here, it's my understanding that in addition to the scenarios that have been developed out of the process you're running, that this group has the ability to add, in essence, add scenarios to what's evaluated, and that I don't know what I don't know what the limitations are, but that we can ask, we can supplement the list of scenarios and get data from the Brattle Group on those. And I don't know that for a fact, so I want to check while we have, this is our first face-to-face conversation with Brattle Group. So is that correct that if the committee comes up with additional scenarios, we can feed them to you and they'll be analyzed using the same process that you'll be using on the 6 scenarios coming out of the department's process?
Well, we would need the DPS's consultant, SEA, to analyze those additional scenarios first and give us the results of their analysis, which form the input of our analysis. And then, yes, we could analyze additional scenarios. We'll need to work within the schedule and budget that we've got, but certainly in principle, yes, our model can analyze additional scenarios if we have them specified in the same way as the original 6.
Okay, great, thank you. And TJ, so I guess that also means it has to go through your shop first before it gets to them. If this committee working group says we have, whatever would constitute a 7th or 8th scenario, do you have the capacity for us to bring that to you and for you to move that through the process so it can go on to Brattle Group?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
We would need more money and more time. I I will note that we have scenarios, but when you all look at that, you'll see a number of scenarios and they have different percentages for kind of tier 2, for example. And then we have a number of sensitivities. So if there's a scenario, for example, tier 2 going to 30% by 2035, well, that can be modulated to 20% or remain at 10%, right? And so there are a number of sensitivities as well, but no additional scenarios.
I have a question before, just a show of hands. How many people are very familiar with the scenarios as they're getting developed and been part of that either public process or conversation? So some of you have, others of you may have some looking at to do if you're curious about it. 2 comments that I know are on hold.
Yes, I also wanted to note that I see a little bit of yellow peeking out behind the red.
Just has his hand up again. This is really unfair that you're trying to have to do a button, but people are looking out for you. Go ahead.
So I wanted to sort of second the concern, just to put it plainly. This working group is 2 hours and 8 minutes old, and most of us had not seen these scenarios before this morning. That's not to say they weren't online and publicly discussed, but as far as the Brattle Group doing work for this working group on behalf of the legislature, it is concerning to me that that is going to be entirely reliant on a whole set of scenarios that were predetermined outside of this process. So that just, I think, is something that I wanted to state plainly on the record. I also wanted to just note that at least 2 of those scenarios are not, in fact, renewable energy standards, because they include nuclear power. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a separate conversation, but this is a renewable energy standard working group, and 2 of the scenarios are not that. And then the last, this is actually shifting to a question, which is, TJ, you spoke to sensitivities in looking at these, quickly. It's sort of 6 scenarios, but actually it's more like 25 scenarios, right? Because if you've got 10, 20, 30% tier 2, 20, 30, 40% new renewables in the region. So the question, I guess, I think is actually a little bit less for you and a little bit more for Brattle. When we're talking about 6 scenarios being modeled, do we mean 6 scenarios, or are you actually intending to model all of the variations of each of those scenarios? Are we going to see like 25 or 30 different costs, or economic models output, or are you picking one within each of the 6?
How much variation will you show? Brattle Group?
I think we will, in principle, we can analyze any number of specific scenarios. And when I say scenario, I mean combination, full specification, which might include, one sensitivity or another, which ends up being 2. In principle, we can do as many as can be specified by the DPS's consultant. In practice, we may be constrained by schedule and budget limitations.
Schedule is tight. Yes.
My question is about number 7 and 8 specifically deal with very specific types of households, low and moderate income, and then inequity between residential households. And I was curious which, if any, of these data analyses are going to give us some insight into those particular pieces.
Brattle Group?
Yep. So for the economic impacts and how it impacts households, we do have income households differentiated by income levels, the 5 different income levels. So at least for the economic impacts for households and consumption patterns and employment, we should be, not for employment, but for consumption patterns, we should be able to differentiate them across income levels.
In the back of my mind, there is data incoming, but there are also questions that this group and others can chime in on to try to weigh out. What does the data tell you? What do you know about different impacts? Specifically 7 and 8, because there's softer, more hitting questions in there, some of which are not even fully transparent yet, probably. So Chase, go ahead, and then we'll come back to the room.
Thanks. I guess I have I'll start by just saying that I am a bit confused. I understood earlier, and Senator Ann Watson is not here, so I do not intend to speak for her, but I understood her question earlier to be whether the Brattle Group would be helping this legislative working group assess the scenarios and the technical aspects of this work that this working group was hoping to explore. And I thought that that's how I understood her question to be. I thought that I heard that the answer to that was yes. And so I'm just I'm a little bit confused, given that it seems like the Brattle Group is building the analysis here based on scenarios that are being used in a different forum and based on assumptions that, mathematical assumptions that are being determined in a different forum. I believe that's what I heard. So I guess my question really is, I'm seeking just a point of clarification, because I'm curious to know how the Brattle Group is fitting in here. Is it largely supporting the work that is being done already in the department and using the department's models and assumptions, or is it supporting the work being done here? And there might be overlap, of course, but I think as Ben noted, this group is only a couple of hours old. And so anyways, and my question is basically reiterating what I understood Senator Ann Watson's question to be is, how is the Brattle Group fitting into the work that this group is doing rather than the work that, for example, the Department of Public Service is doing?
I have a response to that, but go ahead, Brattle Group, go ahead.
So we can only analyze scenarios that have been specified sufficiently, and our understanding is that those are going to be specified by the DPS's consultant. And so we can analyze the scenarios that they specify. We've been asked to analyze the scenarios specified by the DPS's consultants. I would hope that those scenarios are closely related to what this working group needs to understand. But in the end, because we are tasked with doing the macroeconomic modeling, not with developing the inputs to that, we're limited to analyzing the scenarios for which inputs have been developed. And of course, we're happy to work with this group in order to ensure that we develop inputs for the right scenarios that will tell you what you need to know. But we're not leading that process. We're sort of doing the analysis at the back end of that analytic stream.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess then the second part, just again, a clarifying question. I understand, was the RFP for the Brattle Group's work, that is an RFP that is intended to support this body's work? Did I hear that right? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding sort of how that is intended.
Well, the RFP was specified for us to do the macroeconomic analysis on the results of the DPS consultants scenario, on the scenario specified by the DPS consultants, presumably in conjunction with the DPS and hopefully with his working group.
Okay, so we're going to take a comment now in the room.
So I just want to kind of bring us all back, ground truth us, and I don't know that Chase was here for this, but most of the folks in this room and around this table were part of the development of the legislation that has caused this group to be here. And as the person with the support of our chair and our speaker that was running around seeking the agreement to get this group formed, I would challenge anyone to dispute the notion that it was not made abundantly clear that we would not be running two competing analyses with the department, but that this process would be informed by what was happening at the department. I certainly hear the concern and share it about being limited to what the department may put forward, but I think that we can consider that as part of our analysis. But I think it was, I would love to hear anyone's, if I don't understand that correctly, that it was not really clear that we would not be running two competing analyses leading into the work that this group will be doing.
whether it was clear then or not, the facilitator in me backs up that piece of process-wise, it doesn't make sense to duplicate work, nor do you want to undercut work in which the public has largely invested its time in. So to the extent that there's still availability to inform those scenarios as they go forward and raise those questions. And then the complementary questions that don't get raised there and come here for consideration. So I know there's a couple different comments. We'll come here first.
Yeah, I just want to share the confusion that's been expressed. And I guess Representative Sibilia, I wasn't in the weeds of the legislation, but I do recall that there seemed to be some tension at the end of the session about whether this should be a DPS-driven analysis or it should be independent legislature. And I thought the decision was made that it be kind of rest with this group to make those decisions. So it seems like the outcome is confusing.
And what decisions do you mean?
Well, the scenarios. But what the analysis that the Brattleboro group is going to be doing.
So if we weren't running two competing analyses, how would that happen?
I'm not sure.
So neither am I. And so I feel like we knew that this was happening with the department, and we know that these scenarios are coming in. They may not be the scenarios that this group would like to consider. And so we will have to grapple with that. But we did not intend, certainly with this legislation, it was not my understanding to bring in competing analysis. So it was to work with what was coming out of the department, which is a much more extensive and lengthy process than the process we're going through, to sort of hone and chew and get to something leading into the session. And again, I noted, Brian, that you said you weren't deep in that process. I know there are others here at the table that were, and so I would invite any of them that might like to challenge my recollection of what happened to please speak up.
And the NRC was involved. I just personally wasn't. And Chris Pearson is hiding behind the live side.
I know that's a really unfortunate. So there's a comment online. There's also one in the room. I'll take the comment in the room first and then come to online just simply because I recognized it first and saw it. Go ahead.
I agree with Representative Sibilia as to what the conversations were. I apologize in advance, getting a little deep in the weeds here. That's my nature. I noted that all the language on the Brattle Group's presentation talked about reductions in costs. And to be honest, we aren't seeing that with the existing res. So I hope that the analysis will go both ways. And if there are cost increases, they actually will be identified. I'm curious on the couple of things. When you're talking about avoided T&D costs, I think this is a DPS question probably. I'm seeing both. We've got utilities in Vermont doing analysis on what loads will look like under tier 3. And I've seen a presentation by us in New England, very consistent. They're both talking about a tripling of the load if we actually electrify the way the res here talks about it. I just want to understand, is that load increase and the resulting build out in transmission and required upgrades included in the analysis, or is that kind of a cost on the side that we'll have to identify? And on the rate impacts, I'm going to keep hammering this point at every meeting until we talk about it. You get a very different answer if you look at rates as an average across the state versus if you look at the impacts on individual customers and utilities. So where in this analysis are we actually looking at what happens to each utility under the decisions we're talking about? Or is that also we're doing a statewide look and the utilities are left out?
Is there an answer to that question?
Yep. At least for the last question, the macroeconomic impacts will be at the state level. So again, I think there was an earlier question that was asked about having utilities differentiated within Vermont, but no, this, at least in the context of the macroeconomic analysis, we'll be looking at impacts at the sector level within Vermont.
Does that include rate impacts? Is Brattle doing the work around the rate impacts?
The rate impacts is, the rate impacts can be taken from our analysis, but usually rate impacts can be taken as an input from the benefit cost analysis. So if the benefit cost analysis has results on what the resulting bill impacts would be, we can incorporate that as a source of economic impacts in our macroeconomic model.
My understanding is the DPS consultant will be addressing the rate impacts, and I don't know whether they'll be doing that at the utility level or at the state level.
So I can answer that. The consultant is looking statewide. So that said, with the results of the model, we'll have different potential distributions of renewable energy cited in and out of state. That can subsequently make assumptions for how much will be required to be purchased by each utility relative to their current set of resources. And so it's not the SEA consultant's work, so it won't be, the draft won't be done beginning of November and, final in November, draft in October. But subsequent to that, I believe we'll be able to do analysis or provide the workbooks that will allow for the analysis to look at utility-specific impacts. To your question on load, load is a sensitivity in the analysis, so we will be looking at a load that's equivalent to the climate action plan mitigation scenario, what we would expect load to be if we were to hit the Green Global Warming Solutions Act targets. And so we will see increased load. I don't have an answer for you right now on how additional T&D costs, that will happen because of that load will be incorporated. I can get back to you on that.
Just make one statement before. So the reason I raised the point is Morrisville Water and Light is doing their integrated resource plan right now. And they actually looked at that scenario where they have a full electrification build out. Projections they had for just their utility was $50 million of investment in their T&D. And if that level of cost isn't included in our macroeconomic analysis, we're going to get very wrong results in this conversation. That's the only reason I raise it. Okay.
Christopher, you've been patient.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to have this chance early on in our process. The joys of the citizen legislature are many, and there are a lot of strengths, but one of the probably strongest, the most intense weakness is the vulnerability around data. I've sat through hundreds of committee hearings, and if you're an opponent of change and a supporter of the status quo, your best strategy is to come in, flash a lot of data, with intense numbers, and you're confronted in the Senate by 5 or 7 people with effectively maybe one staff, one attorney, and potentially some advocates on their side. So getting this, I would say in my experience, watching experts come in and claim impacts of hundreds of millions of dollars, only to see in a few years them same experts coming in, and that was sort of a scare tactic, because it turns out they were already making those investments. Just as an example, I've experienced that directly. So Representative Sibilia talked about competing scenarios. I'm hoping it's not too late and we can think of this as complementary scenarios. I think it's just shocking, really, that we would form this group and not have a very direct and explicit opportunity to provide some scenarios and some decision points to get modeling as a group to inform and potentially compete against modeling that industry interests and the DPS and others are also looking at. But it's just a direct question: will this group have the opportunity to do our own work, come up with some our own ideas through our process, a broad range of stakeholders here. I'm already hearing additional sensitivity than the current framework, particularly around various utilities. Will we have that opportunity to get that data? Because otherwise, frankly, this whole conversation seems somewhat futile.
Christopher, that question is kind of a loaded one. It's not a decision for mine to make, but I'm going to weigh in here.
Can I just say, it is not a loaded question. This is an independent body set up by the legislature, signed by the governor, and we're hearing whether or not we have the power to have some of our own analysis. I'm not trying to be confrontational.
Let me make transparent about how I'm catching that question. Separate from, because I'm not invested party in here, I'm just a process party. That you have an opportunity to work with information and circumstances that have been unfolding all summer, and a new added analysis for this group to work with, not coming down as answers, but to really inform, figure out where the liabilities are, figure out what it tells you, what it doesn't tell you. The confusion for me is how this group is going to operate, given that there's a pretty large public engagement process informing various scenarios in which you can be a part, I believe, and to actually use this smaller subset to then bring in another set of scenarios as a process person becomes problematic because of this process isn't set up to have that robust engagement. So I think your question is, can we raise questions? Can we pose weaknesses, talk about the liabilities, and figure out if there's other questions we can pitch to these consultants for answers? Probably the answer to that is yes. Questions are always fair game, but creating new scenarios to throw in the mix, I don't know that it's my decision. It's a complicated question, though. Senator Bray.
So I'm glad we're getting into some messy stuff right away, because we should sort some of these things out and be helpful to all of us to be more clear. The language in the bill itself that says that we can have data analysis recommendations at the direction of legislative members always suggested to me that there was a door open for additional analysis work that would officially come at the request of the legislative members of the committee, but we had, in essence, access to analysis to the committee. I understand too that there's the DPS process and there are scenarios flowing into our work already. I had thought that my reading of it wasn't. I'm learning by hearing the discussion. But my understanding was that they would be, there'd be the scenarios from that working group, but they would not be exclusively the scenarios that would get that kind of economic analysis. So in here now, when I asked, Battle Group, can you do more scenarios? And they said, well, it depends on whether the department can do more scenarios. And then and TJ was very straightforward about it. We don't have resources to add different scenarios at this point. So we are in an awkward place where I'm not impugning in any way the scenarios that are coming, but it does feel like we're a little bit handcuffed in terms of being able to say, well, we learned something in this group, and now we have more educated questions that we want to go back to our consultants with. And maybe that just means there's going to be follow-on work. But my hope was always that there would be an opportunity to get the department's work. It would not be exclusive. We could add to it and complement. And certainly I wouldn't. Last thing, sorry.
That's fine.
The department scenarios, I don't know them well enough. And so my hope is that before we reconvene, that everyone can really study those. It may be that what feels like the scenario is being overly constrained and that this group wouldn't get data it wanted. They may already be in those scenarios in terms of adjusting sensitivities within them. So I just don't want to judge it before I understand it. But I do feel this tension back and forth between can we ask more questions? Or are we saying the scenarios are it at the outset, which does feel obviously awkward because this is only meeting one and we'd say, well, that door's closed, and that would feel odd.
But you're inviting questions to say, if you look at those scenarios and note specific omissions, or if it's anchoring the position on unhelpful or leaving pieces out, specifically, what are those pieces?
Yeah, I mean, we all do our,
Homework?
well, this won't sound well, but we all do our homework on those scenarios and say, well, great, but it didn't include X, Y, or Z. Then at least we can be specific about what did we want to know that isn't yet covered.
In the interest of time, I'm wondering how many different comments, and I'm going to go back first to questions for the consultants, then to comments. How many people still have a question for the consultants, either PPS or Brattle Group? Raise your hand, please. 2. Okay, so we'll take it in the room and then we'll go up to you, Chase.
Total switch of topics is a question I had before for TJ. So we heard before you were in the room, I don't know if you were listening, some discussion about the IRA and why the funding with the IRA makes this the time to look at res reform, which was not something that I had considered. Can you speak to me about observations the department might have about the IRA making this an optimal time to consider the res? What would happen if what the difference would be if there wasn't the IRA funding?
So my understanding of the analysis that the impacts of the IRA will be incorporated into the cost of resources in the analysis. And so there's, I think, 2 kind of big giant buckets of potential IRA funding that will support renewable energy development at this time. And one is the extended tax credit, right? 30% tax credit for the next 10 years, and then bonus tax credits for if those solar is going to low income customers. So a lot of additional reductions in cost for renewable energy. There's also just direct dollar funding. The department is submitting a grant application and it's a competitive solicitation, but for $100 million of funding from the EPA to support solar in various variations. And so there's a lot of direct funding. There's tax credits. Tax credits are able to be taken by non-private entities now, so it widens the scope of that funding. And so yeah, there's a lot of money available that reduce costs.
Can I just sorry, let me clarify my question. Are there impediments to the res? Does the current res impede utilizing the IRA funding?
No.
Chase, did you have a question still?
I do. It sounds like the conversation has moved to a different topic. I had actually a question for you, Jennifer, about process, but I'll hold it if now is no longer appropriate because we moved on. I'd be happy to.
I'm looking for questions for the consultants right now. And if you have a question about process, let's hear it.
Okay. I appreciate that. I am returning back to the conversation we were having a minute ago about, as I heard you frame it, Jennifer, about process in considering scenarios. And I am curious to know, is there a process for us to consider different scenarios besides those that the administration is looking at?
That was just under discussion. And I think that the co-chairs are going to help inform what business you do for the next 3 or so, maybe 2 or 3 meetings. I'm not quite sure when those data will be available. You have time to work with. How those questions get framed, what's appropriate and appropriate charge for this group to take forward without duplicating efforts. I think those are nuances for the co-chairs to think about and for me to try to follow so this process is an effective use of everyone's time. It might be a combination of some homework that happens so that you walk in here knowing what those emissions are that you're worried about. And it's probably also a matter of discipline for us to sit down and really think about what are those topics 1 through 8? And staying as clear to task as possible. It's a somewhat muddy answer. I think it's an answer that says, under consideration, what form it's going to take to be determined, not by me, but in concert with your co-chairs. Before we adjourn, we're going to go to next steps in which we can pull out some of the threads that came forward today so that you know what you're trying to consider in building this next agenda or series of agendas. That was the last pass for questions for the consultants. Okay.
I had a comment.
Okay.
So my comment was simply, I am hearing the concern around the data, and I wanted to offer an alternate viewpoint, which is that we have been having this conversation for many years, and without the ability to have a shared data set that you and your team with many, many stakeholders have invested a lot of time in, and we have a mediator, and I expect any data set to be sort of, it is what it is, right? It's already a compromise. So I feel optimistic that we will have some tools at our disposal that will inform the conversation and will make it more robust and will be perfect. So just, that's all. I think I like the process that you've set up.
That's so polite. It's like right out of my peripheral view.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, just before we leave this, I think, so we're at kind of an awkward place. And I think I'm just talking to Co-Chair Sheldon about, a homework assignment for all of us could be to study, distribute and study the scenarios, learn more about them. And I don't know the answer. To what degree do they include or not include things of interest to some stakeholders in the room, And are they adjustable through sensitivities, for instance, to be dialed into those other versions? So to me, it's an open question. I see where there's an awkwardness to where we are at, but in terms of the path forward, studying the scenarios would seem helpful to all of us as part of coming back next time.
And part of what you're saying is if it doesn't show up in a scenario, it doesn't mean it can't be discussed here. It's just a different way of discussing it, and it may or may not be possible to get all the data crunched on it.
Yes. So I wanted to speak to something you said earlier, Representative Sibilia, a comment you made about not there being a clear understanding amongst folks who were discussing this late in the session. I was certainly one of them. That's no secret that this was not intended to set up a competing process. I absolutely agree with that characterization. The distinction that I wanted to draw for the group, or at least how I think about this, there's already sort of competition, so to speak, in the modeling that's being done, right? This amount of renewables, that amount of renewables, is nukes in, is nukes out. There are different options that are sort of competing with each other. We're going to get a chance to look at a lot of data about those things. I don't think the legislative members of this working group, as you laid out, Senator Bray, based on the language in the statute forming this working group, offering different options to be analyzed creates competition. A competitive process would be two totally separate sets of energy and then economic modeling with different inputs that come out with different answers, and nobody knows how to reconcile that. So having more options on the table that are coming out of this working group, I think actually makes a lot of sense. And I also just wanted to speak to your characterization, Jennifer, and something that a couple other folks have said about it somehow being inappropriate for scenarios to be coming from somewhere other than the department's working group. The department's working group is a public process. This is also a public process. There are elected officials on this that are on committees that are very relevant to this work. And so the idea that there's only one valid place for scenarios to come from, I actually don't buy that. And that if that were the case, then that's what the statute would say. And it definitely does not say what, that describes. If it did, then this wouldn't have been a surprise to so many people in the room.
Can I just ask a yes/no question?
Sure.
Are there already scenarios missing that you all are aware of? Like, because I haven't looked at them yet, and so I'm getting the sense that possibly you already have done your homework, and I just kind of like, yes or no? Are there gaps in the scenarios that the DPS is moving forward with that you're aware of already?
I want to dig into these. Just speaking for myself, I don't know if that's to me or the room.
You don't know yet.
I don't know yet.
Okay, I just wanted to.
I want to leave the door open.
If there was real, like you already knew that you had a concern before we spend much more time on this.
Well, so, yeah, it's a good point around what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, where does this all fit in? One of the things I am going to be looking for is to see, I'm really trying to figure out what questions do you want to discuss as a group? That is what my ear is going towards. I'm also really aware that this doesn't happen in a vacuum, and there's so many other hours of effort that have gone into some scenario planning. How do you use that in concert so that it's not duplicative and it's also honoring all of the public's work that's gone into that process? This process here is public, but it's not designed as a public engagement process. It's not going to get the same robust comment, insight, pushback that's from a wide, I mean, there's many stakeholders here. It's not comprehensive. So we'll just be weighing that probably for the next, I was trying to do the numbers in my head about how many hours you have together, but knowing that there's so many hours, do you want to put that work to good time, good use? Let's do a regroup because it's past time when our consultants had agreed to be here on the call, and we really do appreciate that you're here. I suspect questions are going to keep coming towards you around what you can and can't do, what the data can and can't tell. So thanks for working in partnership with this group. Yes.
Can I just ask a clarifying question for myself?
Yes.
So the department has analysis that they've contracted for. JFO has contracted on behalf of this group for analysis. It's two different types of analysis, correct? Can we just clearly state that again? I'm sorry if I missed it before. What is the analysis that you contracted for the department?
So I characterize our analysis as benefit cost analysis. So taking the costs with all the assumptions of renewable energy versus all the benefits of renewable energy to understand the impacts relative to the baseline, which is the current renewable energy standard sensitivities. My understanding is the Brattle group then takes that. Our analysis will have a set of outputs for different scenarios. Brattle group takes that as inputs to its analysis to do that macroeconomic analysis of what does this mean for jobs? What does this mean for Vermont's economy writ large? Like if there are rate reductions because of, any scenario, then that turns into more disposable income for households. That turns into more, spending at restaurants, et cetera. And the inverse is also true. If there are more costs, that turns into less of that. And so those types. So it's benefit cost analysis as inputs to macroeconomic analysis.
Helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Senator Bray.
Thank you. So in terms of, I'm just looking ahead to how we sort our way through this question. What are the scenarios include or exclude? What's the right source document for us to work with? I know there's an August 1 essay, PowerPoint. That's what I was using to look at scenarios, but I don't know if that's the right document for us to use.
That is the most recent document, yes. So in that document, you will see that there are four kind of the core four scenarios that were built with input from many of the stakeholders in this group. And then there's options for other scenarios in that document. There's four, choosing two of them, and those were done. And so we're expecting to choose those. Actually, we're expecting to choose them on Monday. We've gotten all the input in from our members. So, we could send a single slide with the 6 scenarios probably by the end of the week, if that makes it easier for folks. Also happy to come at the next meeting and present on those and what we, mean by that. We'll leave that up to you, but I'll leave that offer.
Yeah, so I have a quick timeline to pull up just to see if I'm lined up with when that data is going to be available. I'm going to share it on the screen, so that means it's going to take over everyone for just a minute. The reason I'm sharing this is because as we look ahead with the co-chairs trying to figure out how this group is going to use its time, a lot of, we're here on September 6th, and each of these boxes represents one of your working group meetings. It's not until sometime in October that I have that modeling data coming out of the department.
That's correct.
So when you come, are you coming with a draft or a draft that's public? Or are you just not available to come to this group until?
So it depends on what I'm coming for. So I could come to the next meeting with the scenarios if you wanted to talk about those. But in October, I'm not sure the dates. Oh, October 4th is the meeting.
Yep.
I'm not positive if it will be ready. The draft analysis will be ready on the 4th or not. I'm hopeful that it will be, but I can't guarantee that.
That's still a helpful distinction. So scenarios might be ready sooner to talk about actual draft analysis mid-October. And is there a distinction among this group around what's going to be more or less helpful to spend time on?
So I think I just want to clarify. I think I heard that there are 4 that are chosen. There are 4 that are in the midst of being chosen, 2 chosen from. So I would love it if we could actually see all 8 before just to
Yeah,
have that.
we can send that document is the one that the senator is talking about, and that I can send that, make sure you have the right one today to post on the document. I think you do, but, and we'll update.
Okay, so this timeline looks generally sometime after maybe October 4th, but probably it's going to be mid-October by the 25th. Battle Group isn't on the call anymore, but it looks like because they're working from some of that data, their analysis won't be available until in draft form, November 1st. The reason I bring this up is because this group probably wants to devote some time to really ask questions of that data, push against the pieces that you're concerned about or you see missing, and have that rigorous kind of engagement with it. So that's going to take up some time in your meetings here and something to queue up consultants for, just to be prepared and ready to get those visuals so they're easy to see and to ask questions. It means that you're not really working with that data to inform your decisions towards the end of this process. We're going to take a brief break so I can regroup with your co-chairs around how to use the rest of this meeting, but there are, that leaves some question about where to spend some time at the end of September and early October, 2 meetings, and what's going to be good use of that time. Let's take a quick adjourn because it looks like maybe that would be helpful for a moment. Just a 5-minute break and then come on back and we'll pick this up.